The Soviet Union counted everything. Every test flight, every heartbeat recorded during centrifuge runs, every gram of pressure in every altitude chamber. Records were kept the way a state keeps records when it believes history is watching and intends to look good for it. The space program was not just science. It was evidence. Evidence that Soviet communism worked, that their system produced what the West could not. Which is why, when the official records stop adding up, when a reference leads nowhere, when a face vanishes from a photograph that had already been published before anyone had reason to remove it, that is not a clerical error. That is a decision. Behind one of those decisions sits a name that should have been known for 60 years and wasn't. His name was Valentin Bondarenko. He was 24 years old, and the Soviet government spent 25 years making sure you would never hear it. To understand what was at stake, you have to understand what cosmonauts actually were. Starting in 1959, the Soviet Union quietly began combing through military aviation records for a very specific kind of person, and the search was entirely secret. Pilots being evaluated had no idea why they had been flagged. They sat through grueling medical screenings and psychological battery tests, including 2-week isolation stays, centrifuge runs pushed to the edge of blackout, and chambers where the air was thinned to simulate altitude, while doctors watched to see who held together and who did not. More than 200 candidates cleared the initial phase. By the end of 1959, 20 men had been selected, and the specifications had been exact. Male, between 25 and 30 years old, no taller than 1.75 meters, no heavier than 72 kilograms, because the capsule was small and every centimeter mattered. On February 25, 1960, the selection was announced to nobody, entirely classified. Unlike NASA, which introduced its Mercury astronauts at a public press conference to a cheering room, the Soviet Union told the world nothing. A cosmonaut's name would remain unknown until after they had already survived their mission, and that asymmetry was deliberate. It meant the program could only ever be seen succeeding. After the first flight succeeded, Soviet propaganda presented cosmonauts as living proof that the communist system produced something the West could not match: heroic, technically brilliant, individually masterful. What the propaganda left out was that the Vostok capsule ran almost entirely on automation. These men were passengers dressed as pilots. The image was the point, and keeping that image intact required complete control over the story. Valentin Bondarenko entered the world on February 16, 1937, in Kharkiv, in what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. His father left for the Eastern Front in the first days of World War II, and Valentin spent the following years in wartime hardship alongside his mother. Aviation pulled at him from childhood, and he had already joined the local aviation club while still attending school. By 1957, the same year Sputnik launched, he had completed aviation training. He married a woman named Galina, had a son named Alexander, and earned promotion to senior lieutenant in the Soviet Air Force by December 1959. On April 28, 1960, he was selected as one of the 20. Among those 20, Bondarenko was the youngest, and his fellow cosmonauts called him Valentin Jr. Mild-mannered, they said, with a good singing voice and a decent table tennis game. He was 23 when training began, and he would be 24 when he died. March 23, 1961. Day 10 of a 15-day endurance experiment. Bondarenko was sealed inside a low-pressure altitude chamber at the Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow, a controlled environment built to test how cosmonauts held up under extended isolation. The chamber's atmosphere ran at least 50% oxygen. Normal air sits at around 21%, and that difference is what made everything that followed unavoidable. In an oxygen-rich atmosphere, materials that would merely smolder in ordinary air ignite almost immediately, and a fire you could smother in a regular room becomes something you simply cannot stop. He had finished his work for the day. Bondarenko peeled the medical biosensors from his skin and cleaned the attachment points with a cotton ball soaked in alcohol, standard procedure. Without looking, he tossed the cotton ball aside. It landed on the electric hot plate he had been using to heat tea. The cotton caught. He reached for it with the sleeve of his woolen coverall, and in that atmosphere, the wool did not slow the fire. It fed it. A doctor watched through a viewport as this unfolded. The chamber was pressurized differently from the outside corridor, and equalizing that pressure to open the door safely required nearly 30 minutes. The fire consumed most of the available oxygen in the sealed space before anyone reached him. By the time the door finally opened, Bondarenko had suffered third-degree burns, the kind that destroy every layer of skin across most of his body. At Botkin Hospital, the attending surgeon recalled that when he attempted to place an intravenous drip, the only intact blood vessels he could locate were on the soles of Bondarenko's feet, the one place his flight boots had shielded from the fire. Yuri Gagarin arrived at the hospital as the assigned death watch officer and sat there for hours, waiting. Bondarenko died 16 hours after the accident. Less than 3 weeks after that, Gagarin flew into space. Hold that for a second. The man who would become the most famous human alive sat outside a hospital room in Moscow, while a 24-year-old with a good singing voice burned to death. And 3 weeks later, the whole world was celebrating. Monuments went up, and streets were renamed as the Soviet system delivered its proof that history belonged to them. Meanwhile, back in Kharkiv, a woman named Galina and a boy named Alexander received quiet orders from the Soviet Defense Ministry. The family would be provided for, as befits the family of a cosmonaut, and they were to say nothing, because as far as the state had decided, none of it had happened. Erasing Bondarenko required ongoing work, not a single decision but a maintenance job that ran for years. He had already appeared in official group photographs and films of the first cosmonaut cohort, which meant those images had to be changed. From one official 1961 photograph of the top 6 candidates, his face was physically AR-brushed out. British researcher Rex Hall later identified 5 faces in total that had been erased from an earlier group photograph of 16 cosmonauts. Bondarenko was not the only one removed, just the most documented case. When American space journalist James Oberg published a before and after comparison of the same photograph, one version with a person present and one with that person replaced by background scenery, the Soviet response was to commission better forgeries. The original retouching had been crude, so later versions introduced invented background details, fabricated texture, and painted scenery filling the space where a human being had stood. Cosmonaut Alexei Leonov, one of the most celebrated figures in Soviet space history, was questioned directly by Western journalists about the altered photographs, and he denied everything, repeatedly and without hesitation. What gives the cover-up its full weight is what it ran alongside. 5 months before Bondarenko died, on October 24, 1960, an ICBM prototype called the R-16 detonated on its launch pad at Baikonur. killing the head of the Soviet strategic rocket forces, and somewhere between 54 and more than 100 other people. The official Soviet statement reported that he had died in a plane crash, and families of the other victims received the same story. That disaster stayed officially unacknowledged until 1989. The Bondarenko cover-up wasn't exceptional. It fit a system that had already shown it could make 100 deaths disappear without visible strain. Western analysts had noticed the discrepancies long before they could prove anything. Articles in Soviet scientific journals mentioned a young Valentin, and then stopped with no conclusion and no follow-up, as if someone had cut the page, alongside photographs showing visual anomalies and numbers implying a larger cosmonaut group than anyone was publicly naming. By 1980, James Oberg had assembled enough from physician accounts, published fragments, and the pattern of erasures to reconstruct what had happened, and the story entered the Western record. Soviet citizens still knew nothing. In 1971, the crew of Apollo 15 placed a plaque on the surface of the moon, honoring every astronaut and cosmonaut who had given their lives reaching for space. Bondarenko's name was absent from it. As far as the official record stood, he had never existed. In 1986, under Gorbachev's limited new policy of openness called Glasnost, a Soviet science journalist named Yaroslav Golovanov published a series of articles in Izvestia, one of the main Soviet state newspapers. For the first time, Soviet citizens encountered the name Valentin Bondarenko. They read that he was 24 years old, read what had happened inside the chamber, and read that he had died before Gagarin flew, and that all of it had been concealed from them for 25 years. Golovanov put it plainly. Valentin was the youngest of the first batch of cosmonauts. He was 24 years old. That was the whole statement. A journalist in a newspaper speaking a name that had been forbidden for a quarter of a century. In 1991, the International Astronomical Union officially renamed a lunar crater on the far side of the moon after him. That crater measures roughly 28 kilometers across and sits in a region no human eye has ever observed directly without traveling there to look. Even his memorial is somewhere you have to search for. Valentin Bondarenko is buried in Kharkiv, and his parents watched that burial in 1961, alongside a medal no one was permitted to mention, and a family that had been ordered to keep quiet. The Soviet space program kept meticulous records. What it could not tolerate was a record that made the program look fallible, so it retouched the photographs, coached the families, had celebrated cosmonauts deny everything to foreign journalists without flinching, and painted invented scenery into images to cover the space where a human being had stood. For a long time, it worked completely. What finally broke it was not a defection or a leaked document. It was a journalist who, in 1986, used careful and precise language to say, "There was a young man. His name was Valentin. He was 24 years old, the youngest of all of them, and he died before any of them flew. He existed." The state spent 25 years making sure you would never know that, but he existed, and now you do. That is not a small thing to give back to someone.